Well, hello and welcome to another Mindmaxing podcast. And I'm glad to be here with my friend Jerry Rhead, who I've known for over a decade now. A good friend in Michigan who we like to joke about walleyes and cheese curds and all sorts of stuff. But Jerry always brings a smile to my face and always has a quick wit and a fun joke and is always there with a euchre deck to be able to play some cards with. But we're here today to hear from Jerry about some of the things that he's thought about over this last year. It's been a heck of a year this last year, and would love to hear from you about your reflections. So let's hear it, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Um, what's really interesting to me, and every time we kind of reflect or think back on the last year in a global pandemic, right? COVID-19. I remember I actually went in February of 2020 to the UPCEA um, conference that was in New Orleans, right? And so it was early in February of 2020, and it's so great to see everyone, all the stuff. You've been there, how great those experiences are. And coming back from that, obviously there was conversations there about, hey, this thing's going on overseas. What is anybody thinking about? Is anybody doing something? And come back from that, kind of get into the next week, and things just were escalating, right? There were more and more concerns and more issues. So having conversations internally in our department at MSU, I think we probably should start thinking about this. And there were already some things that were going on, but the story here is we actually sat down with a consultant and got perspective, right? and I looking back, it's power of reflection, right? Hindsight's 2020. The message was from the consultant was, this is going to last. This is going to last for about 4 weeks, but to be safe, plan for 6 weeks, right? So plan for disruption for 6 weeks. So this is mid-February. On March 11th, I think it was, we went dark, right? We got about actually sitting in the committee meeting of folks from around campus who were saying, when this happens, what are we going to do? What are we doing? What kinds of things are we setting up? And, the email came out about 11 a.m. on March 11th from the president that said, okay, we're going dark, if you will. And as you can imagine, that created all kinds of questions. And what I remember most about it is I moseyed upstairs a couple floors in the building that we're in, and this advisor was coming down the hall, and you could just tell by the look on her face she was extremely upset, and she poked her head into another office, and I can't repeat most of the words that she said, but it was more or less, how in the world do they expect that we're going to be able to do these things in a remote and online environment? How are we going to do our job? How are we going to figure this out? And that question, if you will, or that concept came up so many times. It has come up so many times in the last year. Like, how are we going to get through this? What are we going to do? And keep in mind, we've been doing online programming and have had online courses for over 20 years. So it wasn't like we had to stand up a shop to produce. It wasn't like we had to, a lot of the things that if you weren't in this space, I can't even imagine what that would have been like. And another part of the reflection is in being able to talk to some of those people that were in those spaces that didn't have those things and what they had to do. It just really makes you appreciate the team of people that you work with every day. It makes you appreciate the other people that are in similar areas or complementary areas that, just said, hey, this is a forest fire, right? I've never held a fire hose, but how do I roll this thing out? I'm here to help. We stood up all kinds of different programming. We had to go and talk to tons of vendors and partners and extend contracts or create contracts, right? I mean, I think anybody who lived through this, who works in higher ed, knows what a monumental task that really is. So, I think just kind of, now that you have a few months to look back on and say, obviously there are things we could have done better. There are different approaches we could have taken. But I think my single biggest thing is just, when you're faced with an issue like this that's so huge, so unpredictable, the people that are around you are so important. Because yes, can an individual make a difference? Sure, but it takes a team of people to really be able to work through those issues. So I think my one word reflection would be just really appreciation is kind of where I end up, at least today, right? And looking back.
That's really neat, Jerry. And as a small company, and as a leader in a small company, I recognize the importance of that appreciation. I'd be interested to hear what you've done, what you've seen others do to demonstrate that appreciation and to help people, I guess, feel appreciated. What are some of the things that you've seen or done that have worked in your mind?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and honestly, they're pretty simple, right? You could probably make a mountain out of this molehill and try to say, well, like, what are we going to do? I think one thing is just verbalizing it and telling people, right? Just sharing it out and being able to say, hey, I know how hard you worked. Fortunately, we have some built-in mechanisms in things that we were already doing in our meetings and other kinds of things where that, there was already track laid for doing that. But as I look around at leadership in, from the highest level, it was just taking the time to say, I know how hard this has been. I know what you've had to endure. I know what got thrown off the tracks in order for you to be able to do this. And, most everything that we did was with the learner in mind, right? Even though sometimes I know learners say, man, this is terrible. I don't like this. This is really bad. But it was, okay, if we do this, what impact is it going to have on the learner? And I think taking the time to actually say it and pause, and then you got to get back to it, right? But just taking that. I think the other piece that's been really helpful is setting up some mechanisms for. I mean, it's one thing when that comes from leadership, right, or people in positions. Maybe there's an expectation that they do that, and when they do it, it's great. But we also set up some mechanisms through some of our platforms for frontliners, if you will, to be able to recognize other frontliners, right? In a way that if they wanted that to be a little bit more public, right, or they could even do it anonymously, but it wasn't just like, hey Lee, what a great job you did, right? I could actually publish that, if you will, and call out some of the amazing things that were being done that may have otherwise not really been noticed, right? Because there was so much going on. So I think those two mechanisms were really good. And what it did is when you saw those, right, it exposed things to you that said, you know what, we are moving, even though it feels like we've got, a van full of cinder block or a truckload of cinder block behind us. We are moving. And so, at least for me, it provided some inspiration. And I'm like, okay, right, I'm not in this alone. There are other people who are doing this and doing that. And I really appreciated those mechanisms. And we're fortunate in the unit that I'm in, where we have a leader who really values that, that recognition and being pretty transparent about those things. I recognize that doesn't exist everywhere. So again, I think that's part of my appreciation aspect of the reflection, is that would I have gotten through it? Probably. I'm a pretty thick-skinned guy, but having those moments were really important.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Jerry. And now that we've had, and you brought me back, I remember being in New Orleans together almost a year ago in a couple
Yeah.
of weeks.
Yep.
And you know, now I'm in a new place and we're at a new place. I'd be interested in your, what's in the near term that you guys are going to go do, execute on, or that you see higher ed doing and doing differently as a result of this last year.
Yeah. So I'll kind of start with the higher end of it first. You know, what I've tried to do in this is maintain perspective, right? And it's pretty easy, I think, to get overwhelmed with everything that's going on, right? If you're feeling overwhelmed and you're like not sure what to do, don't be hard on yourself, right? I think that's a completely normal kind of reaction to this, right? Every day something is different or changes, new information, misinformation, not sure about information, right? But in higher ed, I think that perspective is really about finding balance. And yes, in the very beginnings of this, did we have to shift a lot of weight over to a certain area? Yes, because that's where the response was needed. That's where things had to happen. But as you start to think about, the next several months or maybe the next year, what I'm trying to keep in perspective is, how do you maintain balance? And that's easy to say, right? It's like, well, yeah, maintain balance, hoo, right? But in thinking about this and kind of the setup for this and the questions that you asked in the introductory phases of setting this up, it really made me kind of think about. I was trying to think of an analog or a metaphor, and where I ended up was with like tightrope walking, right? If you want to learn how to tightrope walk, um, what what's the single biggest element of being able to be a successful tightrope walker? What do you think?
I'm guessing balance, but I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking,
Yeah, yeah.
don't
So I,
fall off, don't fall off.
yeah, don't fall off, right? Even if there's a net, you don't want to fall off. But what was really interesting in kind of thinking about this from the analog of tightrope walking is, right, I'm not sure I would ever try tightrope walking, even if it was literally 1 foot off the ground, because I'd probably break something. But now imagine being strung out across the Grand Canyon, right, or something, right? So you can think about, okay, well, what are the weather conditions like, right? Is there wind, right? Is the sun going to get in my eyes? But the number one thing, it really comes down to balance. But the way you achieve balance is via your posture and kind of the way you carry yourself across the tightrope. And the reason posture is so important is that what you're trying to do is remove that reverberation, right? In the things by every movement that your body makes, even the ones that you don't know your body's making, right? It causes that cable to vibrate and move and shift. So posture is so important. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought posture is really interesting, right? I have bad posture from the standpoint of chiropractic spinal conditions, right? So I think about it from that perspective. But really, I thought about, what does posture say, right? And it kind of got me into this idea of, back to perspective. It's, if your posture is indicating that you're concerned or you don't know what to do, or you're not sure what the next things are, that sends signals, even though almost all those signals now are sent virtually over Zoom or Teams or some other piece. But I think that's, particularly if you're a leader of a unit or you're working in that space, that posture to be able to get that balance you need to be able to get across the cable is really, really interesting. And then it kind of turned my thoughts to you, this idea of, do you just put your head in the sand and say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, poke my head up and hope this is all gone? And like any kind of crisis or any kind of issue, that's certain death, right? I was on a call with somebody last week, and they were saying, previous leadership, what they would have done is they would have stuck their head in the sand. We're saying we've got to figure out how to move forward, right? We've got to take a growth mentality in this. We've got to look for opportunities, even though those opportunities may or may not look the same as they might have a year ago. We've got to identify that. And I think if you can do that with balance and posture, and not stick your head in the sand, and really look at where the opportunities are. And let's face it, we just made, every higher ed institution around the world just made major pivots, right? Major pivots. Even if you already had infrastructure, you still had to make major pivots. If you didn't have infrastructure, you had to make even bigger pivots. And so this navel gazing and all these kinds of things that we complain about in higher ed, a lot of stuff got done in the last year. Some of it really great, some of it maybe not so great. But you have an opportunity to look at that from a balanced perspective and say, what worked? What do we want to continue to do? How does that benefit our learner? What kinds of things do we scrap? What kinds of things do we retrofit? And if you can keep a balanced perspective, you don't have to get overwhelmed by all of that, right? If you try to figure out all of that at once, I suspect you would get overwhelmed. So, when I think about it, it's leverage the work that had to be done because you were forced to move. And is that moving in the direction that makes sense? Is there an opportunity to continue to break down barriers and leverage what you've done? And where is the overall opportunity? And what can you do in the short term to continue to move in a direction that's balanced?
I just published a blog reconsidering what's essential, because I think this has caused us to take a hard look at that. But as a leader, I often think of myself as a duck needing to maintain a calm on the water, but underneath my feet are paddling like all get out. So
Yep. Yeah. That's a great metaphor. That's a great metaphor.
I don't always show it, but
Yeah.
a lot of times there's a lot of activity going underneath the water. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where the balance comes in, right? Because are there days when I'm overwhelmed and I'm concerned? Sure, but it's like when you take your, or when you're go through driver's training, right? They tell you, look down the road, right? Don't look at the yellow line right in front of you, right? Look down the road. And I think that idea of perspective and being able to say, okay, yeah, I've got all this crushing stuff happening right now, but where am I trying to go? Where is the unit trying to go? Where's the institution trying to go? Where am I trying to go individually? And if you can meet that with perspective and balance, are all days going to be good days? Certainly not. But if every day you come in and you're just overwhelmed and you're like, okay, where do I use the axe today? Right? All you're ever going to do is be surrounded by fallen trees, right? And so like, okay, well, where am I trying to get? What path am I trying to make here? And I think you can do that. You can do it individually. You can do it at the unit level. Harder to do at the institution level unless you're, the provost or the president or the chancellor, or whatever it might be. But I can tell you in our own institution, those people have turned to us to say, what in the world do we do? Right? If we know we have to be better in this space, what are your ideas? So right there is an opportunity. Even if you're not being asked, it might be because those people don't know to ask you. I suspect in most cases they do, but there's an opportunity, right? Don't just say, well, what we're doing is, we've padded up and, I got the deflector shields on. Is like, no, go forth, right? Move forward, find a direction, and do things in small chunks. And if it's working, keep doing it. If it's concerning, adjust. And I think that's the only way that I can see to get through this. Because otherwise, I pull the remaining 7 hairs out of my head.
So as we're thinking longer term, which we often do, and really looking at 2022 and beyond, what are some of your anticipated ideas of what's likely to happen, might happen, either for higher ed in general, Michigan State, yourself, and so on?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and so I'll start with the one that I know you've talked about this before. but I think I'm going to call it wellness, right? You can equate that to physical health, mental health, right? But I like the idea of wellness. Is it to me? It encompasses a couple of things. I think it encompasses obviously health as we would consider it. Like, are we healthy beings? Are we are we able to do things because we're not sick, we're not mentally ill? Obviously, there are tremendous pressures on our learners, on our staff, on other people that we interact with. And I think that's really going to require us to think about how we structure our support mechanisms, both in the form of what we deliver to our learners, but also how we take care of the people in those spaces that are making and delivering those things. I think that's going to become a key piece. I think you prophesized about that several months ago, but I think we're really starting to see that now. And I mean, that's everything from, just paying attention to body language, even though you're not probably physically next to the person. But if you're looking at your colleagues, how are they responding? And I think we have to pay attention to that. Or it could be a really bad situation. I think from kind of a programmatic or strategy perspective, um, there were already the analog or metaphor I use here is like a busy London roundabout, right? There were already a lot of throughways that were running into that roundabout, right? You've got the 2025 cliff, where the number of high school graduates is plummeting. You can look at it from that perspective. You can look at it from a millennial or a Gen Z perspective, right? I mean, millennials are already adult learners, right? At least from the perspective of like who we serve, or in the unit that I'm in, who we're trying to serve, right? Yeah, we still have 50,000 undergraduate and graduate on-campus students when we're not dealing with COVID. So that's a huge part. But my focus here is on what does this mean, and what has this pandemic done to allow us to better serve those people. And it was already, again, several throughputs into this roundabout of we're going to have to figure out how to serve those learners. They're not going to graduate, come out of a job, and work there for the next 20 years, right? Through automation, all the other kinds of things that we know about, there's going to be the need for that continual upskilling. And all the other variables in there, cost of education. I've talked with you about that before, right? That I think we need to really be able to meet people where they are, and we need to be able to deliver them the education and training and development that they need when they need it. And we've got to get better at that. And some institutions are already moving or already there. Others are thinking about that. Others are, thinking about other things. But it's become pretty evident to me that if you just kind of stick in the online space, that competitive landscape has changed drastically, certainly in the last 10 years, but really in the last 5 years. All the old adages, build it and they will come. We don't have to worry about this because we're this. We don't have to think about that because, these things. That, to me, has all blown up, right? And I see it every day. We think we've got a student coming into a program, and we find out that, nope, they went with another institution. Why? Because that institution turned around their acceptance in 2 days. We're lucky if we can do that in 2 weeks. Sometimes it takes 2 months. Right? So you really, what I've found is that if I go and complain about those things, nobody listens to me, right? One, I've been around here at Michigan State too long, right? Where they're like, you always complain about this stuff, right? But when you can bring it from the learner's perspective, and when you can include those people in what you're proposing to do, that resonates, right? When a current student or a prospective learner is saying those things, it hurts a little bit more, right? They're used to me saying those things, but they hear it from a student. You're like, darn it, you're right. We need to look at this. Um, so I think really figuring out how to design programming and products and learning solutions that are going to meet the learners where they are. And I think we have to do a better job of staying connected with those learners across their lifetime. If this sounds a little bit like the 6-year curriculum, Dee Dee and Richards, there are some of those elements there, right? How do we stay connected to those learners so that we can hopefully, at least in our case, others have done this. We're not there yet. So one of the things we're striving to is how can we be proactive? How can I come to you, Lee, and say, hey, we know enough about this industry that this is likely going to happen to you, and here are some options for you, as opposed to waiting for you to get laid off, right? Or to say, hey, if you can't get these skills, then there's not going to be a place here for you, right? What's better, right? If we could come to you and say, hey, we're anticipating these things might happen to you. We're not asking you to come back and spend another 60 grand and get another degree. What we're saying is we can provide you these shorter types of learning experiences that are going to skill you up so that you can be able to make these transitions. That's a hard thing for us to do, and I suspect maybe some other higher ed institutions. That's not how they're built, but it's coming. That again, those roads leading into that roundabout, it was already coming. It was going to happen at some point. But I think this COVID piece has really shifted us to see where we have opportunities and where we have gaps. We need to leverage the opportunities and we need to address the gaps.
Well, I'm reminded of in Scouts taking my emergency preparedness merit badge and thinking then, well, these are just good things to do anyway, even if there's not an emergency. They're like good things to do. And then I'm also thinking about 508 compliance when we were trying to do online and making sure it was accessible to all populations, regardless of disability or access. And if you did things that were 508 compliant, they were better designed programs.
Exactly.
And it just made sense. One of the things that struck me though about what you were saying is related to this last year, but it was happening well before COVID, is the idea of the student, the learner-centered, or I'll call it customer, and the whole concept of on demand, which like on demand now has become like on steroids. People expect on demand like stuff to show up at their doorstep from Amazon. They expect Netflix to have the exact show that they want to watch at that moment. They expect their broadband to work all the time, regardless of the load on the router. And so on demand, I think we've amped up I'll call it consumers' expectation of on demand. And I think that's going to impact how learners approach their experience with education.
I couldn't agree with you more. A colleague of mine worked on a project here probably 4 or 5 months ago. And we went out and we talked with the commonality among the group that we talked to is everyone had received an undergraduate degree, right? So they all had their bachelor's degree. We talked to people who had just graduated, right? That were employed. So they were in their first year or 18 months of their job. We talked to mid-career folk, and then we talked to folks that were, not ready to retire, but at the tail end. And this was not a scientific study, right? We were just prepping for a presentation. And what you just said was at the heart of what they said. So one of the questions we asked them is, when you think about the things that you've had to learn since finishing your undergraduate degree, right? Where did you go to get that information? And I know you can probably imagine what the number one answer is, right? YouTube, right? They went to YouTube.
Yeah,
right. They Googled it and they ended up watching a YouTube video, right? And if content wasn't there, and what was interesting is everyone had, at least with the short inquiry that we did, they all had a huge affinity for their alma mater. They didn't hate their undergraduate experience. They didn't hate where they went to school. It's just that on demand. It's like, I don't have time to go and research a program, try to find out if there's a program, try to understand what's in that program. I've got to be able to go into work tomorrow or by the end of the week, and I've got to know how to do this thing, right? Or I'm going to be suspect, right? I've got to be able to figure this out. And I mean, it wasn't that it like blew me away, as I've done that myself. It's like, oh crap, see, the sink's leaking. How do I fix a leaky sink, right? Oh, YouTube. Let me try to find the Kohler faucet video, right? I'll try to figure out how to fix this thing. But what was really interesting to me is that as we dug into that a little bit, we started to see some of these other issues that we all know exist in this space. It takes too long, right? Even if I found something, I can't dedicate 18 months, right? Is I have to have the solution faster than that. And then you can imagine also cost, right? I can't spend $20,000 to figure this out, right? I need, and the thing that I think about, and I don't know, I'm not trying to make a COVID vaccination metaphor here at all, but it's the idea of like the inoculation, right? How do you give somebody that initial shot so that they can satisfy their immediate need, and then have opportunity if they decide that they want to get the fuller immunity by coming at getting more? Or it could be in the next week they need a different kind of infusion, right? Or inoculation. And do you have that in your portfolio? Or like, how could you respond to that? And so you can imagine all that goes into that, right? You can listen to the customer, you can listen to the learner and try to see what their needs are. You can forge better relationships with industry and other kinds of organizations to try to be anticipatory. But honestly, at the end of the day, I think a lot of those signals are already out there. We don't have the antenna, right? We don't have the antenna to pick up those signals. So we have to do a lot better job of listening, paying attention, making it important, not just playing lip service to it. And this is where people will click off, right? Particularly if you're a faculty member. But faculty got to get over the fact that they may not be the only person in place in the world that knows the end all be all on this thing, right? That there are other ways to create these opportunities that aren't them pontificating for 50 minutes about whatever this is, right? That most of these people had, there were some administrative components to their jobs, but a lot of them had what I would say would be more tactile outputs, right? So they had to learn a process, and they had to be able to deliver on that process. And they don't, for better or worse, I don't care what the theory is behind it. I just need to be able to do it.
I'm reminded of late 90s when we were doing a lot with performance support, and we used to use the adage of just in time,
Yep.
just enough, meaning not too much content, and just right, meaning relevant to the person with where they were contextually in their job. And those were the sort of the three drivers for how we tried to structure what we called then learning objects back with Cisco, and we were trying to create these reusable learning objects that were just in time, just enough, and just right. And I think that does challenge the structure of large credentials and things like that are maybe more of a horse pill than someone really needs at that moment. And then cost, obviously, as you mentioned, is a factor. But the micro-credential, I'll call it movement or whatever it is, I think is going to get a lift through this as well. So
yeah, and I agree with you, and I think the smart thing, and we're really trying to focus on this, is so if you kind of look at the spectrum of where a learner might be, where can you meet them on that spectrum, but not leave them stranded, right? It may be that they just come in and they get that one shot and that's all they want and that's all they need, but you formed a relationship with them, right? if they recognize, or you have the opportunity to suggest based on your market intelligence and your area intelligence, you have to have the pathways, right? And I think that's hard, because right now the pathway is, well, do the undergraduate degree, right? Or maybe you have a certificate that I can take, and that certificate transfers into my undergraduate or my graduate program, and then I'm kind of done. And then maybe there's opportunities for me to take a whole bunch of one-offs, but how are they connected? What can they do? How does what I do within those learning experiences translate so that somebody on the employment side, or the employer, can actually understand what I'm able to do? And then how do we help people, learners, actually articulate what they're able to do, right? The transcript is a formal record with a bunch of stuff on it, and a bunch of words and a bunch of numbers, but it doesn't really say, what competencies does this person have? What is this person able to do? And with technology and approaches and everything out there, I think we can make that so much more transparent, and we can really demonstrate to an employer or an organization what that person's able to do. And in turn, by kind of unpacking that, the learner can better articulate what they know how to do, and they can understand they can understand the language that they just learned. And instead of being able to ask where the bathroom is and get a cerveza or a beer or whatever it is, right, they actually know what it means, and they can say, yeah, you're asking for this, I know I can do it because I've already done it, or I've done these things in parallel and it's transferable. And I think that's challenging. Some folks are already doing it, and so it isn't that this is a vast Milky Way that has to be explored. There are ideas and implementations that can be leveraged, and I we're looking at those things. There aren't that many original ideas anymore. It's really about how do you repurpose, how do you co-create and get to those new experiences.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and really appreciated spending some time together today, and want to say thank you for joining us for a MindMaxing podcast, and look forward to talking with you soon. So thank you.
Thank you.